The air inside the old community hall was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of floor wax, stale popcorn, and the damp wool coats of the people who had gathered there on a chilly Saturday evening. It was the kind of night where the wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, but inside, the atmosphere was less about the weather and more about the town's annual tradition. The Oak Creek Talent Show was not exactly a high-profile event. In fact, for most of the year, the building sat empty, serving as a home for dust and spiders, but tonight, it was packed. Every folding chair was occupied, and the overflow crowd stood in the back, leaning against the peeling walls, holding paper plates of cake and cups of lukewarm coffee. The mood in the room was a mixture of boredom and polite tolerance. Up until this point, the evening had been a long parade of amateur acts. There had been a little girl who forgot the words to her song and stood crying on stage until her father carried her off, followed by a local boy who tried to juggle 3 apples and dropped them repeatedly, much to the amusement of his friends in the front row. The audience was tired. They were shifting in their seats, checking their watches, and whispering to their neighbors about the price of feed or the upcoming harvest. The low murmur of conversation buzzed constantly underneath the acts, a sign that no one was really paying attention anymore. Then, the master of ceremonies, a balding man with a cheap microphone that squealed with feedback, stepped up to the wooden podium. He shuffled his index cards, looking for the next name. The crowd settled slightly, expecting another child or perhaps a poetry recitation that would put them to sleep. "All right, folks," the announcer said, his voice booming and echoing off the wooden beams. "Up next, we have, Mrs. Higgins. Martha Higgins." There was a pause. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd like a wave. People looked at each other, raised eyebrows, and whispered. Everyone knew Martha, of course. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone. But Martha Higgins was not known for having talents. She was known for her hard work. She was the woman you saw at the grocery store buying flour in bulk, the woman standing beside her husband at church, quiet and composed. She was the farmer's wife. Martha was sitting near the back, usually invisible in the crowd. But now, as she heard her name, she stood up. She didn't look like a performer. She looked like a woman who had spent the day scrubbing floors or weeding a garden. She was wearing her Sunday best, which was a simple, dark blue dress that had been ironed carefully but looked a decade out of style. Her shoes were sensible, low-heeled black leather that had seen plenty of walking. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun at the nape of her neck, not loose and flowing like the women in the magazines. There was no glitter, no makeup, and no attempt to draw attention to herself. As she began the long walk down the center aisle toward the stage, the conversations didn't stop immediately. People were asking, is she going to sing, or maybe she's going to show us how to bake a pie? There were a few chuckles, not mean-spirited, but amused. It was funny to think of Martha up there on the stage, under the bright spotlight, when they were so used to seeing her in the background. The stage itself was small and cluttered with the remains of the previous act. A few people stepped forward to clear away the juggling apples. In the corner, standing slightly off-center, was an old upright piano. It was a massive beast of dark wood, looking out of place and a bit neglected. It was usually only used for choir practice, and even then, it sounded a bit tinny. The lid was propped open, revealing a row of slightly yellowed keys. Martha climbed the wooden steps at the side of the stage. Each step seemed heavy, and the wood creaked under her weight. She didn't smile or wave at the audience. Her face was serious, almost stern, with deep lines etched around her mouth and eyes. These were lines that came from years of squinting into the sun and worrying about the rain. Her posture was rigid, shoulders back, head high. She moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has 1,000 chores to do and no time to waste. The murmur of the crowd began to die down as she crossed the stage. It wasn't out of respect, but out of curiosity. She walked past the microphone stand where the singer had stood, ignoring it completely. She walked toward the piano. A few people in the front row leaned forward. A piano? Since when did Martha play the piano? No one had ever seen her touch a musical instrument. She was known for canning tomatoes, not playing Mozart. She reached the piano bench. It was a simple wooden bench, scarred and scratched. She reached down to adjust the hem of her dress before she sat down, a modest, practical gesture. When she sat, the bench gave a small groan. The silence in the room grew heavier. The people in the back stopped talking. The whispers faded away until the only sound was the rustle of paper programs and the distant hum of the furnace. From this distance, under the harsh glare of the stage lights, Martha looked even more out of place. She looked like a boulder sitting in a flower bed. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. Then, she reached out and placed her fingers on the keys. It was then that the audience noticed her hands. They were shocking against the pristine white and black keys. They were not the hands of a lady of leisure. They were broad, rough, and reddened from the cold. The knuckles were swollen, likely from the early morning chores of milking cows or chopping wood. There were calluses on her fingertips and small scars across her skin, souvenirs from a lifetime of farm labor. A woman in the third row stared openly, wondering how such rough, weather-beaten hands could even press the delicate keys without breaking them. The general feeling in the room was one of pity mixed with awkwardness. Everyone expected that when she played, it would be slow, plodding, and perhaps painful to listen to. They expected a simple folk tune or perhaps a clumsy attempt at a hymn. They were preparing themselves to clap politely, to smile and say good job because she was a nice woman, not because she was talented. They thought this was just a sweet, foolish attempt by an old lady to try something new. Martha stared at the keys. Her expression didn't change, but if anyone had been looking closely at her eyes, they might have seen a flicker of something else. It wasn't fear. It was a strange kind of focus, as if she were looking past the piano, past the audience, and into a memory that belonged only to her. She shifted her weight slightly on the bench, testing its stability. She took a deep breath, lifting her shoulders slightly, and let it out slowly. The room waited. The dust motes danced in the beams of light. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. Just as the man in the front row was about to cough, Martha's hands moved. They didn't hesitate. They didn't fumble for the right note. They moved with a sudden, terrifying purpose. She lifted her wrists, arched her fingers, and brought them down hard on the keys. The sound that exploded from the old piano wasn't a clumsy plink. It was a roar. It was a sound so loud and so sharp that the people in the front row physically flinched. The sleepy little talent show was over, and no one in that hall knew what was about to hit them. The sound that exploded from the old piano didn't just hit the ears of the audience, it seemed to hit them in the chest. It was a deep, heavy chord that felt more like a thunderclap than a musical note. The sudden vibration rattled the dust motes dancing in the spotlight and made the loose sheets of music on the nearby stand flutter. For a split second, the entire room froze. The man who had been coughing in the third row choked it back mid-cough. The woman in the front row who had been whispering to her friend about tomorrow's laundry clamped her mouth shut. The air in the hall, which just moments ago had been thick with boredom and the smell of stale coffee, suddenly felt electric. No one moved. Every pair of eyes was locked on the stage, glued to the woman in the simple blue dress. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Sitting there was Martha, the woman everyone thought they knew, the quiet figure who bought groceries in bulk, the one who kept to herself, the one whose hands were usually stained with garden soil. And yet, the sound coming from beneath those rough, calloused fingers was nothing short of terrifying. It wasn't the clumsy, halting tune of a beginner. It was a roar of authority. She wasn't trying to find the right notes, she was commanding them. Before the shock of the first chord could even fade away, her hands moved. They didn't fumble or hesitate. They launched into a cascade of notes so fast that they seemed to blur. It was a storm of sound, a chaotic and beautiful rush that filled every corner of the drafty hall. The old upright piano, which usually wheezed and complained when played by the church organist, was suddenly singing with a voice no one knew it had. Martha was hitting the keys with a force that made the entire instrument shudder, rocking slightly on its casters. But despite the power, every single note was clear. It was sharp, precise, and incredibly loud. The audience sat in stunned silence. In the back of the room, a group of teenagers who had been laughing and looking at their phones just seconds ago suddenly looked up, their faces pale. They had expected a joke, something to laugh about on Monday morning at school. But this wasn't funny. This was intense. It felt like they were witnessing something private, something that wasn't meant for them. The air pressure in the room seemed to change, pressing down on everyone, demanding their respect. As the music surged, the physical effort Martha was putting into the playing became visible. The sleeves of her dress pulled tight as her arms pumped up and down the keyboard. She wasn't sitting stiffly anymore, she was leaning into the instrument, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Her face, usually set in a calm, blank mask, was transformed. Her brow furrowed deeply, lines of concentration etching themselves across her forehead. Her eyes were squeezed shut, as if she were visualizing the music in the darkness behind her eyelids. She looked fierce, almost angry, pouring every ounce of her energy into the keys. It was a stark contrast to the gentle, submissive woman the town thought they knew. Here, in this spotlight, she was a giant. The complexity of the music was baffling to the untrained ear, but even to those who knew nothing about classical music, the difficulty was obvious. Her fingers were moving independently, doing different things at the same time. The left hand was pounding out a heavy, driving rhythm, while the right hand was dancing across the high notes in intricate patterns that seemed too fast for a human being to track. It was a masterpiece of coordination. To see those thick, arthritic knuckles flying over the ivory keys was like watching a heavy rock float. It defied logic. In the front row, the local high school music teacher sat with his program forgotten on his lap. He had attended the talent show ready to politely endure the evening, perhaps offering a few pointers to the eager children. He looked at Martha's hands and felt his own jaw drop. He knew the piece she was playing. It was a famous sonata, one that advanced students struggled with, and one that professionals hesitated to perform in public because of its emotional and technical demands. And here was a farmer's wife, with no sheet music in front of her, playing it with a passion that made his own playing seem mechanical. He watched her fingers, mesmerized. He could see the calluses catching the light, the rough skin that had spent decades gripping tools, now manipulating the piano with the grace of a surgeon. He stopped tapping his foot. He stopped breathing. He just watched. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the music. No one rustled a sweet wrapper. No one whispered. No one got up to use the restroom. The only movement was the involuntary swaying of the audience as the music swept them up. The story of the song was unfolding dark, stormy, and full of struggle. It resonated with the people in the hall. These were people who worked the land, people who knew about struggle and hardship. Listening to Martha play was like hearing the sound of their own lives translated into music. It wasn't pretty or decorative, it was raw and real. Then, just as the intensity reached a peak where the audience felt they couldn't take any more, the music shifted. Martha's hands, which had been thundering with the force of a freight train, suddenly softened. The heavy, banging chords were replaced by delicate, whispering notes. She transitioned from the storm into the calm with a mastery that was breathtaking. The volume dropped until the sound was barely a breath. The hall seemed to lean in, straining to hear the gentle melody that now flowed from her fingers. It was in this quiet moment that the true shock began to settle in for the audience. It wasn't just that she could play fast, it was that she could play with feeling. Her hands, which had looked so clumsy and awkward when she first sat down, were now caressing the keys. The roughness of her skin seemed to disappear, replaced by a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of the woman in the fourth row. The contrast was heartbreaking. Those hands had scrubbed floors and carried heavy buckets of water, but right now, they were creating the most beautiful sound anyone in Oak Creek had ever heard. Martha's face softened slightly as the melody became more lyrical. The anger in her expression melted into a look of profound sadness. It was a look that suggested she wasn't in a dusty hall in a small town anymore. She was somewhere else, perhaps in a memory from a long time ago. The music was speaking for her, saying the things she never said out loud. The audience watched, mesmerized by the transformation of the woman on the bench. She was no longer just Mrs. Higgins, the farmer's wife. She was an artist, a storyteller, a force of nature. A young child in the back, who had been fidgeting in his mother's lap, suddenly went still. He stared at Martha, his eyes wide. He didn't understand the music theory or the history of the piece, but he understood the emotion. He could feel the sadness and the power radiating from the stage. It was the first time in his life he had ever seen an adult do something that felt truly magical. His mother held him tighter, her own eyes misting over, overwhelmed by the unexpected beauty of the moment. The piece continued to weave its spell, moving from moments of gentle whisper back to bursts of intensity, keeping the audience on the edge of their seats. They were no longer judging her appearance or her clothes. They had completely forgotten that she was the woman who sold them eggs at the market. They were captivated, entirely under her control. Every person in that room realized, with a start, that they had been wrong. They had judged a book by its cover, and they had been proven wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The old piano was no longer a dusty piece of furniture, it was the heart of the universe, beating in time with Martha's hands. And the show wasn't over yet. She was just getting started. The storm had passed, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. The last thunderous chord Martha played seemed to hang in the air above the stage, vibrating against the high ceiling. The audience sat frozen, their hands hovering halfway between clapping and resting on their knees, unsure if the song was actually over. It felt like the end of a violent weather event, where you step outside and everything is strangely quiet. But then, before anyone could even take a breath to clap, Martha's hands moved again. They didn't crash down this time. Instead, her right hand lifted and floated softly to the upper keys, while her left hand began to press the bass notes so gently that the sound was barely a whisper. The music shifted. The anger and the force were gone, replaced by something entirely different. It was a melody that sounded like a voice singing a lullaby, sweet, sad, and incredibly lonely. It was the kind of tune that makes you think of old memories, of things you lost a long time ago. The transition was so smooth that the audience didn't realize they were holding their breath until the melody wrapped around them. The contrast was shocking. Just moments ago, this woman was a warrior of sound, now, she was a poet of silence. The music flowed like water, clear and pure, filling the gaps between the people in the hall. As the melody grew, Martha's body language began to change, too. The rigid posture of the hard-working farm wife, the one who stood tall to carry buckets and feed bags, slowly melted away. Her shoulders, which were usually pulled back tight, dropped and relaxed. The severe look on her face softened, the harsh lines around her mouth smoothing out as if they were being erased by an invisible hand. She didn't look like she was in a drafty community hall anymore. Her eyes were closed, her head tilting slightly to the side as if she were listening to a voice only she could hear. It was a look of complete peace, a look that no one in Oak Creek had ever seen on her face before. The people in the front row watched her hands closely. It was hypnotic. The rough, swollen knuckles that looked so awkward and painful now moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible. She was using a technique called legato, where the notes are connected smoothly, one melting into the other without a break. Her fingers danced across the white keys, barely touching them before moving on, like insects skimming over the surface of a pond. The calluses on her fingertips, usually a source of toil and pain, were now creating a sound of exquisite tenderness. It was a miracle of contradiction, hard hands making soft music. The silence in the room changed texture. Before, it was a silence of shock and confusion. Now, it was a silence of reverence. The teenage boys in the back, who usually couldn't sit still for 5 minutes, were leaning forward with their elbows on their knees, completely mesmerized. The music was speaking to them without using any words. It was speaking about the feeling of missing someone, or the feeling of being tired after a long day but finding a moment of beauty. It stripped away the differences between them. The rich shopkeeper and the poor field hand were feeling the exact same thing at the exact same moment. High up in the balcony, the local music teacher stopped staring at her fingers and started listening to the story she was telling. He realized with a jolt that she wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was playing with rubato, a stolen time. She wasn't playing the music strictly by the clock, she was speeding up and slowing down, stretching the time like a rubber band to pull more emotion out of the melody. It was a sophisticated, artistic choice that only a master musician would dare to make. He shook his head slowly in disbelief. This wasn't a farm wife amusing herself. This was a soul that had been silenced for years, finally finding its voice. The melody began to climb, getting higher and louder, building up a wall of sound that wasn't aggressive, but overwhelming. Martha swayed with the music, her body rocking gently. She was no longer sitting on the hard wooden bench, she was floating inside the music. It was a strange, almost spiritual sight to behold. A woman who spent her life dealing with the harsh realities of nature, drought, mud, and livestock was now creating something that felt ethereal and heavenly. The dusty hall, with its peeling paint and folding chairs, seemed to disappear. In the minds of the audience, they were no longer in a small town. They were in a grand concert hall in Vienna, witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime performance. A young mother in the third row felt a hot tear roll down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, embarrassed, but then she looked around and saw that she wasn't the only one. The tough old farmer sitting next to her, a man known for his grumpiness and silence, had his eyes closed tight, his jaw clenched as if he were in physical pain. The music was touching a bruise inside his heart that he didn't even know existed. It was reminding him of his late wife, or perhaps the dreams he had when he was young. The music had that power. It was bypassing their brains and going straight for their hearts. Martha's left hand began to weave a complex pattern of notes underneath the melody, supporting it like a strong foundation holding up a house. Even though the music was soft, it was dense and rich. You could hear years of practice in every bar. She wasn't guessing. She knew exactly where her fingers were going to go 3 notes before they got there. There was a confidence in her playing that came from thousands of hours spent alone in a room, practicing scales and chords while the rest of the world slept. The audience began to realize that the silence surrounding Martha in her daily life wasn't emptiness, it was a silence filled with music. The melody reached its peak, a high, shimmering note that hung in the air like a star. Martha held it, her hand trembling slightly with the intensity of the vibration. The room was so quiet you could hear the wood of the piano creaking in the humid air. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. The emotion in the hall was so thick it felt like a physical weight. People were afraid to cough, afraid to shift in their seats, afraid to break the spell that this unassuming woman had cast over them. Then, just as the note began to fade, her hands did something unexpected. They didn't drop to the quiet ending the audience expected. Instead, they began to move again, faster this time, picking up the rhythm. The gentle lullaby was over. A new energy was building, a return to the storm, but this time it felt different. It felt like a resolution. The music was leading them somewhere, and everyone knew that the climax was coming. They weren't just listening to a song anymore, they were on a journey with her. Martha's eyes opened, staring straight ahead, seeing nothing but the music. The peaceful expression was replaced by one of intense focus again. She was ready to take them home, but she wasn't going to make it easy. She was about to show them the full power of the storm one last time. The gentle, weeping melody that had held the room in a soft trance suddenly began to change. It was as if a wind had picked up, stirring the leaves of a tree before a storm. Martha's right hand, which had been lingering on the high, sweet notes, began to move with a new urgency. The rhythm picked up. The silence between the notes vanished. One moment, the music was a lonely stream, the next, it was a raging river. The transition happened so smoothly that the audience didn't realize they were holding their breath again until their lungs began to burn. The peace was gone, replaced by a rising tension that felt dangerous. Martha's body shifted gears. The gentle rocking stopped. She leaned forward aggressively, her face set in a grimace of intense concentration. Her left hand started to pound out a rhythm that was steady and heavy, like a heartbeat getting faster and faster. The sound was no longer just pretty, it was powerful. It vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the folding chairs, and into the bodies of the people sitting there. They could feel the music in their bones. It wasn't just something they were hearing, it was something they were physically experiencing. The complexity of the music was skyrocketing. Her fingers were now moving in a blur of motion. It was a flurry of notes, thousands of them, cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. Hands crossing over each other, stretching wide, jumping from one end of the piano to the other. But to the music teacher in the front row, it was a display of mathematical perfection. He watched, hypnotized, as she executed difficult runs that professional musicians practiced for years to perfect. She wasn't missing a single note. Every strike was precise. Every rhythm was exact. It was a feat of athleticism that seemed impossible for a woman of her age, let alone someone who spent her days doing hard manual labor. The atmosphere in the hall was electric. The teenage boys in the back were no longer leaning back in their chairs, they were sitting on the edge, their eyes wide, staring at Martha's hands. They had never seen anything like this. It was better than any video game, any movie, anything they had on their phones. It was real, raw human talent exploding right in front of them. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on their arms stand up. Even the dust motes dancing in the spotlight seemed to swirl faster, caught up in the momentum of the performance. Martha's face was glistening with sweat now. A few stray hairs had escaped her tight bun and were sticking to her forehead. She didn't notice. She didn't notice the hundreds of eyes staring at her. She didn't notice the creaking of the old bench under her shifting weight. She was in a different world. In her mind, she wasn't in a dusty community hall. She was back in a concert hall from her past, or perhaps she was in a field of corn, feeling the wind blow, translating that feeling into sound. She was fighting a battle with the piano, and she was winning. The music was pouring out of her, releasing years of unspoken words, years of quiet routine, years of hiding who she really was. The sound grew louder. Martha was using the pedals now, her right foot pumping the sustain pedal to lengthen the sound, making the music swell until it filled every corner of the room. It was a wall of sound, a wave of emotion that crashed over the audience. The woman in the third row, who had been crying softly during the slow part, now held her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The beauty was almost painful to witness. It was the kind of beauty that reminds you of your own smallness, of the things you gave up on, of the dreams you left behind. It made everyone feel exposed and vulnerable, yet they couldn't look away. The tempo increased even more. It was a frantic race to the finish. Her hands were flying up and down the keyboard, striking the keys with incredible force. You could hear the hammers inside the piano hitting the strings, a distinct mechanical thumping that blended with the music. The old piano was groaning under the abuse, but it was singing beautifully. It was being pushed to its limit, just like Martha was. The contrast was jarring and mesmerizing, the simple, elderly woman in the outdated dress, and the ferocious, modern sound she was creating. It was a reminder that you can never truly know a person just by looking at them. Everyone in the room realized, with a sudden pang of guilt, that they had underestimated her. They had judged her by her cover, and they had been completely, utterly wrong. The music reached a fever pitch. It was chaos and order all at once. The bass notes were thundering like drums, the high notes were screaming like a violin, and the middle was filled with a rushing river of sound. It was the climax of the story she was telling. The struggle, the pain, the hard work, the love, it was all there in the noise. The hall was shaking. The windows were rattling. The audience was transported. They forgot about their bills, their problems, the cold weather outside. There was only the music. There was only Martha. She played a series of chords that were so loud they felt like a physical punch to the chest. Bam. 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 Each one hung in the air, echoing off the walls. Then, her hands separated. The left hand kept the heavy rhythm, while the right hand shot up to the highest keys and began a trill, a rapid shaking of two notes that sounded like a bird in panic, or a heart beating out of control. The tension was unbearable. It felt like the top of a roller coaster, that split second before you drop. Everyone in the room was leaning forward, their muscles tensed, waiting for the release. Martha's face was fierce. She was pouring her soul into these final moments. She wasn't holding anything back. Every ounce of energy she had left was going into the piano. Her arthritic fingers, usually stiff and painful in the morning cold, were moving with the speed and flexibility of a teenager's. It was as if the music had taken over her body, pushing past the limitations of her age and her health. It was a miracle of human spirit, a bright, burning moment of life in a usually quiet, gray existence. The music held onto that high point for what felt like an eternity. The trilling high notes screamed against the thundering bass. The sound was huge, filling the entire town. It felt like the roof might blow off the building. The music teacher closed his eyes, unable to watch anymore, just wanting to absorb the sheer power of the sound. He knew he would never hear anything like this again in his life. This was not just a talent show performance, this was history being made in a small, forgotten hall. And then, suddenly, the chaos stopped. Martha's hands lifted off the keys in a sharp, synchronized motion. The sound didn't fade away slowly, it was cut off instantly. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. It was heavy, thick, and absolute. The only sound left in the entire world was the ringing in their ears. The storm was over. The river had run dry. The bird had stopped singing. Martha sat there, her hands hovering in the air, her chest heaving, her eyes still closed. The audience sat paralyzed, caught in the vacuum left by the music. They were waiting, breathless, to see if it was really over. They were waiting to wake up from the dream. But as they looked at the woman on the bench, they knew it was real. They had just witnessed something that would change the way they saw the world forever. The silence that followed the sudden cut-off of music was heavier than the silence before she had started. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on the shoulders of every person in the hall. The final chord had vanished instantly, but the energy it left behind was still vibrating in the air, rattling the windows and humming in the wooden floorboards. For 5 long seconds, absolutely no one moved. No one coughed, no one shifted in their seats, and no one whispered. It was as if the entire town had been turned to stone. The only movement in the room was the dust motes, which continued to drift lazily in the spotlight, indifferent to the miracle that had just occurred. Martha sat on the bench, her hands still hovering in the air just above the keys. Her eyes were closed, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She looked like a runner who had just finished a marathon, sweat glistening on her forehead, her body trembling with the exertion. She wasn't posing, she was just trying to catch her breath, trying to anchor herself back in reality after being swept away by the storm of her own making. Slowly, her hands lowered to her lap. She opened her eyes, and the fierce, intense look that had possessed her face began to fade. The warrior vanished, and the shy, reserved farm wife slowly returned. From the back of the room, the sound of a single pair of hands clapping broke the spell. It was the music teacher. He was standing, his face wet with tears, clapping slowly and rhythmically. Then, another person joined in. Then another. Within moments, the sound exploded. It wasn't the polite, sparse clapping that the other performers had received. It was a roar, it was a thunderous wave of noise that seemed to shake the roof off the building. Every single person in that hall stood up. The teenagers in the back were cheering, whistling, and stomping their feet. The old farmers were clapping with big, rough movements, shouting bravo and encore. The women in the front were wiping their eyes, clapping so hard their palms stung. Martha flinched at the sudden noise. She turned her head toward the audience, looking genuinely startled, as if she had forgotten there were 300 people watching her. Her face turned a deep shade of red, a blush that started at her neck and went all the way to her hairline. She looked terrified by the attention. She quickly stood up, smoothing down her skirt with trembling hands. She looked small and fragile against the massive piano, but she also looked different. She stood taller than usual, her head held high. She didn't bow like a movie star with a flourish, she just gave a small, awkward nod, a gesture of humility that only made the crowd scream louder. She turned to leave the stage, walking quickly toward the steps, as if she were escaping a fire. But the crowd wouldn't let her go. They kept clapping, the noise growing louder and louder, demanding more. The announcer rushed onto the stage, waving his arms for quiet, but no one listened. He finally leaned into the microphone, his voice cracking with emotion. "Martha! Martha, don't go. Please, take a bow," he shouted over the noise. Martha stopped at the top of the stairs. She hesitated, looking at her shoes. She seemed to be fighting a battle with herself, wanting to hide but knowing she owed these people this moment. Slowly, she turned back around. She walked to the center of the stage, clutching her hands together in front of her. She looked out at the sea of faces. She didn't see judgment or curiosity anymore. She saw respect. She saw awe. She saw people who had been touched by something deep inside her. A small, shy smile broke across her face, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and made her look 20 years younger. She curtsied, a quick, old-fashioned dip of the knees, and then she hurried off the stage, disappearing behind the heavy velvet curtains. As she moved through the backstage area, the noise of the hall followed her like a distant echo. She leaned against a wall, pressing a hand to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt drained, empty, but also incredibly light. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. A young stagehand, a boy no older than 17, stared at her with wide eyes as he moved a microphone stand. He didn't say anything, he just stepped aside to let her pass, as if she were royalty. Martha gave him a tired nod and walked toward the exit to find her husband. When she finally stepped out of the building and into the cool night air, the sounds of the party inside were muffled. Her husband was waiting by their old truck, smoking a cigarette. He looked up as she approached. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. He saw the flush on her cheeks and the light in her eyes. He simply opened the passenger door for her and helped her in. He knew that tonight, she hadn't been just his wife. She had been the woman he fell in love with all those years ago, the woman with a song in her heart. Inside the hall, the atmosphere had shifted permanently. The talent show continued, but no one cared about the acts that followed. A little girl sang a cute song, and a man did a magic trick, but the audience was distracted. They were whispering to each other, their minds still replaying the masterpiece they had just witnessed. During the intermission, the hall was buzzing like a beehive. Groups of people gathered in tight circles, talking animatedly. "Did you see her hands?" the baker asked, shaking his head. "I never knew. I've known her for 30 years, and I never knew. I never thought a piano could sound like that," said the woman who ran the post office. It sounded like she was telling us her life story without saying a word." The local music teacher was holding court in the corner, explaining to a captivated audience why what they had heard was so incredible. "That wasn't just a tune," he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "That was one of the most difficult pieces ever written. It takes decades of training to play it like that. And she played it from memory without sheet music. It's impossible. It's a miracle." In the days that followed, Martha became a legend in Oak Creek, but she remained a mystery. People looked at her differently when she came into town to buy groceries or collect her mail. Before, they saw a background character, someone who blended into the scenery. Now, they saw a genius. They treated her with a quiet reverence. The checkout clerks asked about her music. The neighbors waved more enthusiastically. But Martha remained humble. She never bragged about her performance. She just smiled and went back to her work. However, as time went on, stories began to circulate. The town was a small place, and people liked to talk. One story claimed that a distant relative had seen a program in an old attic trunk, years ago. It listed a recital in a big city, far away from the farms and fields of Oak Creek. The name on the program wasn't Martha Higgins, but it was her maiden name. It said she was a prodigy, a student at one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. The rumors painted a picture of a life unlived. They said she had been on track to become a famous concert pianist, to travel the world and play in grand halls for royalty. They said she had given it all up, turned her back on the fame and the glory for a quiet life in the country. People whispered that she met her husband, fell in love, and decided that the simple life of a farm wife was worth more than the applause of strangers. Knowing this, if it was true, only made the performance more poignant. Every time Martha sat at her own kitchen table, or scrubbed a floor, or hung laundry on the line, the townspeople now imagined the music she held inside. They realized that the quiet woman they had ignored for years was carrying a universe of beauty within her, hidden away like a secret treasure. She hadn't lost her talent, she had chosen to share it only with herself, until that one night when she decided to let the rest of them in. The annual talent show was never the same again. Years later, people would still talk about the night Martha played. They would describe the silence, the power, and the shock. They would tell their children and their grandchildren about the night they sat in a dusty hall and watched a farmer's wife shock the world. Martha continued to live her simple life, tending to her garden and caring for her family. But to the people of Oak Creek, she was no longer just Martha. She was the reminder that everyone has a hidden depth, that everyone has a song inside them, if only they take the seat and play.